Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, if you thought you needed a detailed map for our usual source stacks, today you might need a bit more. Maybe a compass, a multilingual dictionary, and possibly a therapist.
Yeah, that's not far off. We're basically trying to impose some kind of structure on, well, a collection of sources that are, frankly, all over the place.
Oh.
Fragmented, complex, definitely political, and sometimes just totally absurd.
It really is an eclectic mix. I mean, the material starts with some pretty intense Brazilian legal and social commentary, right? Coming
Yeah.
out of political forums, judicial opinions.
Exactly. But then these discussions, they just spiral outwards. We end up in core political philosophy, really high-stakes labor disputes, and then completely unfiltered, sometimes bizarre cultural stuff found online.
So our mission for you, the learner, is pretty straightforward, relatively speaking. We want to give you the shortcut to being well-informed on this chaos. We're structuring this deep dive around a central theme, which is the tension between centralized authority and, let's call it, radical individual autonomy. We'll start with the heavier legal and financial topics first.
Right, get the complex stuff out of the way.
Before we transition into the more, let's say, fascinating yet definitely peculiar cultural detours, that's where individual expression seems to run completely wild.
Okay, but before we dive in, we probably need to define some key terms. These will come up a lot.
Good point.
Right, so when we talk about the legal side, you'll hear STF. That's the Supreme Federal Court, the highest court in Brazil. Simple enough.
Not STF.
Then in the labor section, we'll be talking about CLT and PJ. CLT is the formal employment contract system. Think standard job, benefits mandated, structure, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, formal employment and PJ.
PJ stands for Pessoa Jurídica. It essentially means independent contractor status, so you're your own business, basically. Understanding that difference, CLT versus PJ, is really crucial for the labor debate part.
All right. STF, CLT, PJ. Got it. Okay, let's jump right into the deep end then. We're starting with global finance, national sovereignty, specifically looking at the Magnitsky Act in Brazil.
Yeah, and this is where that conflict between sort of foreign authority and domestic control really comes to a head.
So the opening statement we have here, it's quite something. It's an assertion of sovereignty you don't often see, especially on the global financial stage. We've got this statement attributed to Minister Gilmar Mendes, a very powerful voice on the STF, remember, saying that Brazilian banks will not comply with Magnitsky Law sanctions. Just flat out.
Yeah, and this isn't just some minor banking footnote. The Magnitsky Act, for anyone unfamiliar, it's U.S. law. It lets the U.S. government slap sanctions. We're talking asset freezes, visa bans on individuals anywhere in the world.
Right, if they're found responsible for human rights abuses or significant corruption.
Exactly. It's a really powerful tool of U.S. foreign policy, and it's intended to have global reach.
So the idea is, if the U.S. Treasury sanctions some corrupt oligarch, let's say, their assets anywhere in the world should theoretically be frozen.
Right, that's the theory.
But Brazilian banks, according to Mendes, are basically saying, hold on, not automatically here. It's an explicit refusal, isn't it? Refusal to just adopt foreign law without some kind of domestic review.
It is, and it's a very high-stakes gamble. I mean, the view among Brazilian banks, as the sources note, seems to be that U.S. sanctions aren't automatically extensible or applicable within Brazil's jurisdiction.
But what's the risk if they refuse? If they just say no?
Well, the big risk is secondary sanctions from the U.S. Treasury itself. They could potentially be cut off from the entire global financial system. Think dollar clearing, access to U.S. markets.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That's huge. That's the potential price for asserting sovereignty.
It absolutely is.
So how can they possibly justify taking that immense risk? They must have a really, rock-solid legal defense lined up. Otherwise, you'd think they'd just fold under that kind of threat.
They seem to think they do. And part of it, according to the source material, stems from an alleged, let's say, pressure environment. The source suggests this non-compliant stance is happening partly because of pressure from the STF, the Supreme Court itself, pushing banks on how they handle sanctioned individuals.
Pressure from the top court.
Allegedly, yes. The source even mentions specific figures, like Alexandre de Moraes and his spouse in this context, which just shows how politically sensitive these names are domestically. So yeah, the legal defense needs to be pretty much unimpeachable.
Okay, so that brings us to the formal legal basis. There must be a specific precedent or mechanism that allows Brazil to create this buffer against such a powerful foreign law.
There is. And this is where Minister Flávio Dino, who was Justice Minister at the time, comes in. He used what the source calls a fascinating, slightly bizarre precedent.
Bizarre how?
Well, the source makes a crucial point. The original case Dino used to set this principle, it had absolutely nothing to do with sanctions. It was about a mining issue.
Wait, mining? He used a ruling about mining rights or jurisdiction to create a constitutional shield against U.S. foreign policy enforcement.
Precisely. But he used that judgment to establish a really broad legal principle about foreign authority and jurisdiction within Brazil.
Okay, so what's the principle? What's the core idea?
It's what we can call the validation requirement. Basically, Dino established that any decision made by a foreign authority, whether it's a U.S. Treasury sanction, maybe even a foreign arrest warrant, must be validated by a Brazilian judicial authority before it's enforceable inside Brazil.
Right. Let me make sure I've got this for the listener, too. So the validation requirement, it's like the U.S. can issue an international parking ticket, metaphorically speaking.
Okay, here.
But until the local Brazilian traffic court, let's say the STF in this case, actually looks at that ticket and agrees it applies under Brazilian law, that ticket has zero legal effect inside Brazil.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. Yeah, it essentially transforms the STF. It's not just a domestic court of final appeal anymore. It becomes a necessary international filter for foreign legal actions.
The STS is basically saying Brazilian sovereignty dictates that foreign punishments have to pass Brazilian judicial muster first.
Exactly. That lack of automatic applicability, that's the legal shield. That's what theoretically protects the banks from those secondary sanctions we talked about. They can just point and say, sorry, no Brazilian court order yet.
And the implication here is pretty profound, isn't it? The source notes this whole issue, judicial validation versus automatic compliance, is going to be a major ongoing point of discussion in the future. It's about Brazil's sovereignty, its place in global finance.
Absolutely. It's a very public and, frankly, assertive drawing of a legal line in the sand. It says national law, as interpreted and filtered by the STF, overrides the extraterritorial ambitions of foreign sanctions.
So it forces the U.S. Treasury's hand, in a way. They either have to drop the case regarding assets in Brazil, or they have to actually go through Brazil's domestic judicial system to get that validation.
Right. And as we just discussed, getting a favorable validation ruling from the STF, especially concerning individuals who might be closely tied to the Brazilian political establishment, well, that's far from guaranteed, isn't it?
Not at all. Okay, that sets the stage for authority versus autonomy on a global scale.
Yeah.
Let's shift focus now. We're moving from that intense international political standoff right into an equally intense domestic ideological conflict. This time, it's about the future of labor in Brazil. And it revolves around this significant policy push we're seeing to transform app-based motorists, rideshare drivers, delivery drivers, into CLT workers.
Right, and as we established, CLT is that formal mandatory employment system. It comes with robust benefits, severance pay, vacation time, employer contributions, all the standard protections.
The intention seems admirable on the surface, right? Extending social protections to people working in the gig economy.
Absolutely, that's the stated goal.
But the reality, as often happens, is, well, it's messy. We run smack into this really overwhelming data point presented in the sources by Dr. Marcio Eurico Vitrell-Amaro, an economist.
Yeah, this is striking. His data shows a massive percentage. The source says above 80% of these app workers actively prefer the non-CLT model. They prefer working as a PJ, an independent contractor.
Okay, let's unpack this. This seems like a core paradox. Why would the vast majority of workers reject the very system that's supposedly designed to protect them?
Well, the answer seems to lie in a few key areas, mainly flexibility and taxation. As PJs, independent contractors, they manage their own hours, they can set their own schedule, and crucially, they often pay lower, more streamlined taxes compared to the deductions under CLT.
Plus, they have the autonomy, right, to work for multiple apps. Maybe you work only peak hours. They structure their life around the job, not the other way around.
Exactly. That autonomy seems highly valued.
So you normally assume that the people actually doing the work are the experts on their own preferences, their own economic calculations. I mean, for 4 out of 5 drivers to reject the formal structure, that strongly suggests they see a real, tangible benefit, either economic or lifestyle, in being independent.
You would think so. Yet, the source presents this rather astonishing justification offered by a jurist who's advocating for mandatory CLT. When faced with that 80% preference data,
Yeah. What was the response?
The jurist's conclusion wasn't, maybe we should rethink this policy. No, it was to conclude that the drivers son burros.
I call the drivers stupid, ignorant.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Stupid, ignorant, or maybe just incapable of understanding their own long-term best interests.
Right.
That was the takeaway.
That's the ultimate expression of paternalism, isn't it? The expert, operating from, academic theory and legal frameworks, decides they know what's mejor para ellos, what's best for them. And that not just for them, but for all.
Irrespective of the clear quantitative preference of the actual group affected, its expertise completely overriding individual self-determination.
What's fascinating there, though, is the immediate need to discredit that choice. The advocate couldn't just accept that maybe, just maybe, the workers did the math and figured lower taxes and flexibility were worth more to them than the mandated benefits.
Exactly. They couldn't entertain that possibility. Instead, they had to shift the blame entirely, find another reason for this inconvenient preference.
And the scapegoat is, I guess.
As is so often the case when ideology clashes with reality. Social media.
Of course.
Absolutely. Social media gets blamed for infecting people's minds. It's accused of causing them to develop very distorted and depraved comprehensions about labor law.
So the narrative becomes these workers aren't making rational choices based on their own paychecks or schedules. No, they're just brainwashed, victims of digital propaganda that's somehow demonizing the wonderful CLT system.
That's precisely the argument presented. The jurist even mentioned hearing children, innocent kids, saying things like, I don't want to be CLT.
As if it's some kind of contagious disease spreading through society.
Yeah, it paints this picture that the rejection of formal labor isn't an informed economic choice learned from actually working in the gig economy, but rather some kind of deep-seated, almost hereditary contamination.
This really hits on a crucial lesson for you, the listener, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How often are individual preferences, especially preferences for things like flexibility or maybe paying less tax, how often are they dismissed by authorities? Brushed off as just the result of propaganda or media manipulation rather than being seen as legitimate, self-interested choices.
It happens all the time. And the source material adds this beautiful layer of irony here. The narrator observes that the very same jurist who's pushing so hard for mandatory CLT for all these drivers, well, that jurist is very likely a PJ himself, an independent contractor.
You're kidding.
Nope. Enjoying the exact same tax breaks and schedule flexibility that they argue should be eliminated for the working class drivers.
That's cognitive dissonance at its peak. The rhetoric is all about protection, but it serves to impose a costly, unwanted burden on the very people it claims to be saving, while the person advocating for it enjoys the alternative.
Wow. Okay, so we've looked at this conflict individual choice versus external authority in global finance and now in domestic labor law. Let's pivot again, this time to a much grander philosophical concept presented in the sources.
Right. This one tries to define the fundamental difference between entire political systems using a really simple visual metaphor.
Which is?
Doors and walls.
Doors and walls. Okay, explain.
It's actually an incredibly elegant and simple way to think about ideological differences. It bases everything purely on human movement, what the source calls the flow mechanism. It cuts through all the complex economic jargon and gets right to the core issue of personal liberty.
All right, how does it work? So, for what the source labels right-wing countries, and the classic example given is the U.S., the fundamental problem, the main point of control, is at the front door. It's about entry. Meaning so many people want to get into the country, usually seeking economic opportunity or maybe political stability, that the government's main job in terms of population flow is controlling who comes in. Hence, borders, immigration policies, walls facing outwards.
Okay, that makes sense. The challenge is managing inflow. What about the other side?
Conversely, for left-wing countries, and the examples given are places like Cuba and Venezuela, which have seen huge numbers leaving, the suffocation, as the source puts it, is at the exit door.
The problem is people trying to get out.
Exactly. The source specifically notes the staggering numbers of people who fled Venezuela, for instance, many ending up in Brazil. In these systems, the government often needs vigilance, sometimes physical barriers, to prevent its own citizens from escaping the socialist system.
And the ultimate historical anchor for this whole theory, according to the source, is the Berlin Wall.
Yes. The source really emphasizes this point. The wall wasn't built to keep eager capitalists from rushing into East Germany to embrace socialism. That wasn't the problem.
No, it was built specifically to stop East Germans from running out of socialism and into the capitalist West.
Precisely. That historical fact is presented as basically irrefutable proof for this Durs and Walls definition. The wall demonstrates the concept perfectly. Nobody was desperate to enter, only to leave.
It shifts the whole debate, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Away from theoretical arguments about which economic ideology is better on paper.
And towards a very practical, very stark metric. Do the citizens of that system choose to stay there when they have a choice? Or does the state have to actively prevent them from leaving?
But let me just push back on that a little. Is that metaphor maybe too clean? I mean, isn't the U.S., for example, also seeing people leave? Maybe for lower taxes somewhere else or different lifestyles? Doesn't that blur the line a bit?
That's a fair point. Economic emigration definitely happens from right-wing countries, too. People move for tax reasons or retirement or whatever. But the source material seems to focus on the systemic need for containment by the state.
So it's about the state's actions.
Exactly. The U.S. government doesn't deploy its military or build physical walls facing inward specifically to stop its citizens from leaving permanently. Whereas countries like Cuba or North Korea, historically, they build barriers. They enforce strict travel restrictions. They punish defection. Their state apparatus is fundamentally designed to keep people in, often against their will. That difference in the state's posture towards exit, that's the defining characteristic in this model.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. And this flows directly into that ethical test proposed by the philosopher Karl Popper, which the source also brings up.
Right, Popper's test. The source invokes him, saying the true test of whether a society is free isn't determined by who wants to arrive,
But whether you can leave it without being hunted.
That idea is really central to this whole analysis, a society that needs physical force or legal threats just to keep its own people from leaving. Well, by Popper's definition, it's fundamentally unfree. The system itself is based on constraint. The state's power is designed to contain individual autonomy.
Which echoes that same conflict we saw with the CLT drivers,
Yeah.
just on a national scale.
Precisely.
And this section wraps up with the pretty pointed, provocative challenge for the listener.
Yeah, it asks you to observe where your left-wing idols, intellectuals, politicians, celebrities who advocate for certain systems, where do they actually choose to live?
Do they live in the countries that are hard to enter or the ones that are hard to leave?
Right. The narrative presented is that these figures often prefer, quote, a good capitalist country, a place that might be hard to get into but is easy to leave if you choose.
It's definitely forcing a critical look at potential hypocrisy, isn't it?
Yeah.
The gap between ideological rhetoric and lived reality.
It is. The argument is, if an ideological system is truly superior, shouldn't its strongest proponents want to live under it? When they actively seek out the stability or prosperity of the system they criticize, a system characterized by being hard to enter, it kind of undermines the moral authority of their arguments, doesn't it?
It certainly reinforces that core idea from the source, that human movement, the simple act of choosing where to be, might be the ultimate non-negotiable measure of a system's real success or failure in delivering individual freedom.
Okay, so we've gone from global finance to labor law to grand political philosophy.
Let's come back down to earth a bit, back to the messy reality of how domestic authority actually gets applied. And this next section brings us to one of the most unexpected highlights in the source material.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
A judge's incredibly impassioned and completely off-topic rant about.
Yes. This is just a fantastic illustration of the, let's say, unique legal culture that seems present in some of these Brazilian sources. It's this bizarre blend of extreme formality on one hand and then explosive personal opinion on the other.
Blurring the line between a sober jurist and, well, a really angry sports fan.
Totally. So we have this judge's description of a Corinthians game. It took place at the Neoquímica Arena, and the language used in what's supposed to be an official judicial document is stunningly unprofessional.
He declares the team was, and I quote, robbed at gunpoint.
Robbed at gunpoint because of what he calls an absurd penalty that was marked against them in the 52nd minute of the game.
The opinion apparently contains phrases just dripping with pure emotional outrage. The narrator of the source material, quite rightly, questions the decorum here. Like, is a judge actually allowed to call a referee a thief in an official legal proceeding?
It really does read less like formal jurisprudence and more like, a furious post-game rant you'd see on social media.
But the context, that's what makes it truly surreal. This whole football outburst wasn't just random. It was bizarrely inserted into a judgment that was actually supposed to be about something completely different.
Yeah, it was about municipal organization, specifically about transportation during massive public events,
Right.
like the Formula One race they hold at Interlagos, or major football games like the one he was ranting about. The judgment was meant to be authorizing necessary services, things like taxis, the metro, the CPTM, which is the São Paulo commuter rail system.
Right, to handle the huge crowds these events generate.
Exactly. The judge's official task was basically logistical authorization for public transport. But clearly, his personal grievance about the perceived injustice against his favorite team, Corinthians, just completely overwhelmed his professional focus.
The only connection seems to be geographical.
Right.
Stadium is near transport hubs, therefore, rant.
Apparently, that was enough of a link to trigger this incredibly passionate judicial tangent. But what does this tell us, going back to our theme, about authority, the authority of the court?
Well, my reaction is pretty much the same as the source narrators. Why on earth do Brazilian judges, or at least this one, feel the need to include this kind of off-topic babbling, as the narrator calls it, while rendering a formal judgment?
I think it tells us something important. It suggests that judicial authority, in this context at least, isn't always seen as this purely impersonal technocratic mechanism. It can also be viewed as an extension of a citizen's personal voice, their passions, their grievances.
So the judge isn't just ruling on transport logistics. He's actually leveraging his official platform, his judicial authority, to vent about a deep personal injury he feels was sustained watching a football match.
Exactly. It's this blending of the personal and the official that's so striking.
But does it undermine the authority? While it's legally irrelevant to the actual transport issue, inserting such vehement, biased commentary calling the referee a thief, does that cheapen the document? Does it weaken the perceived objectivity of the court?
It certainly adds a layer of, well, unforgettable humanity, that's for sure. But yeah, I think it absolutely complicates the perception of neutrality. It shows that even the most formal instruments of state power, like a judicial decree, can apparently be commandeered for utterly non-official, deeply personal grievances. It's a really fascinating, kind of chaotic glimpse at authority in actual practice.
Okay, we've examined the clash between individual choice and external authority in some pretty high-stakes arenas. Global sanctions, labor law, political philosophy, even the judiciary now. Now we descend.
Descend where?
Into the completely unfiltered, totally decentralized, often bizarre world of digital culture expression. This is where personal autonomy seems to spiral into, well, outright absurdity sometimes.
So we're leaving the STF and the formal structures behind and entering the Wild West of online commentary.
Pretty much. And we start with a truly peculiar cultural critique involving a dog.
A dog.
Yes. Specifically the Caramello monster.
Okay, the Cachorro Caramello. The common mixed breed mutt. That's like a beloved national symbol in Brazil, right? Kind of the every dog.
Exactly. Declared the face of Brazil in some circles. Yet the source we're looking at claims that society has somehow created a monster out of this humble symbol.
Created a monster? How? What's the evidence for this canine corruption?
The anecdotal proof offered is, well, it's something. Apparently, an individual offered one of these Caramello dogs our $10 worth of chicken wings, standard street food snack.
Okay.
And the dog rejected them, turned its nose up at the chicken wings.
Maybe it wasn't hungry. Maybe it doesn't like chicken wings.
But that's not the interpretation here. The narrator sees this as profound social commentary. The dog, obviously corrupted by societal changes, maybe digital excess, who knows, it now apparently wants meat, real meat, not just chicken wings.
And this signifies
a catastrophic loss of humility, even in the nation's animals. Society has spoiled the humble Caramello. Wow, okay, that's reading a lot into a dog's dietary preference. It's the ultimate confirmation bias, isn't it? Everything, even a picky dog, becomes proof of societal decline.
Seems like it. And from spoiled animals, we move rapidly into the chaotic world of human digital aesthetics, as documented online.
The bizarre content just keeps coming. There's a detailed description of a woman's outfit that was apparently circulating. It featured a La Crea t-shirt.
La Crea, the funk dancer, okay.
Paired with very short shorts and decorative dangling balloons attached somewhere. The narrator expresses genuine confusion, sort of questioning if people actually wear these kinds of extreme digital-inspired aesthetics out in public.
It blurs the line between online performance and reality. which then feeds directly into the next point about the crisis of veracity online.
Exactly. This balloon outfit description is immediately followed by an even more extreme and highly questionable claim about another person. Someone who allegedly removed her ribs.
Removed her ribs. Surgically?
Apparently, yes. And then, supposedly, carry them around in a bag. Now, the source narrator, to their credit, immediately and critically questions if this is even true.
As they should.
Right. Yeah. But it highlights how easily these extreme, often completely unsubstantiated claims can circulate online and get discussed almost as if they might be real.
It's the attention economy rewarding the outrageous. And then from body modification rumors, we take a really sharp, sudden, almost jarring turn in focus.
Oh, yeah. Into an example of intensely specific, totally unfiltered desire. Get ready for the hairy armpit discourse.
The what now?
Hairy armpit discourse. This section represents one of the most intense psychological contradictions we found in these sources. A speaker just launches into this incredibly visceral, detailed description of his desire and fascination with women's subico peludo, hairy armpits.
Okay. Visceral how?
The descriptions are intense, bordering on obsessive, actually, and very focused on smell. The speaker talks about a fervent desire to pass the tongue on the armpit hair. He says he loves the specific earthy smells, even referring to the scent as chirino de gorila. Gorilla smell.
Gorilla smell, right.
And declares this whole intimate experience to be a marvelous thing. It has no price, just pure, unadulterated admiration for natural body hair on women.
Okay, so a celebration of natural bodies. Where's the contradiction?
Here it comes. Immediately, and I mean immediately following this fervent, almost worshipful admiration for natural body hair on others, the same speaker calls for a razor.
A razor? For what?
To remove every single trace of hair from his own body. Complete smoothness required for himself.
No way. So he elevates natural hair on women to this primal, almost mystical level.
Calls it priceless.
Yet simultaneously enforces the absolute strictest societal pressure for perfect hairless smoothness on his own body.
Exactly. It's this instantaneous reversal. It's just a perfect snapshot of digital culture sometimes, isn't it? Unrestricted, sometimes unconventional desire projected onto others, while the self must conform to rigid, often contradictory social aesthetic standards.
That's quite the psychological knot. And finally, speaking of rigid standards, we encounter this equally rigid definition of sexual identity in what the source calls the heterosexuality trilemma.
Right. This is about a man who apparently insists repeatedly that he's absolutely heterosexual, straight.
Okay. And the trilemma.
Despite his insistence, he is apparently given 3 times, which in this context is explicitly stated as meaning having engaged in receptive anal sex with other men. 3 separate times.
Ah, okay. So he insists he's straight, but has had these experiences. How does the source narrator handle that?
With zero ambiguity. The narrator delivers this incredibly blunt, unsparing counter-argument. It's based on a very binary, very traditional definition of sexuality.
Which is?
The logic presented is totally rigid. A truly heterosexual person simply would not engage in such acts. Not even once, not out of curiosity, not experimenting, nothing.
So the conclusion is?
The final, definitive point is made, quite crudely. Quem dá 3 vezes o furico é gay. Basically, anyone who gives the butt 3 times is gay. Full stop. No room for nuance, fluidity, or anything in between.
Wow, that's fascinating too. It's such a snapshot of how quickly complexity and personal curiosity can just be flattened out, rejected in favor of a really black and white, unyielding definition of identity, at least in certain online spaces.
It kind of mirrors the rigidity we saw with the judge's view on football or the jurist's view on CLT workers, but applied to the most intimate, personal choices about identity.
Exactly. And to just perfectly cap off our journey into digital absurdity, we arrive at the chocolate mold business.
Please tell me this isn't what I think it is.
The source narrator concludes their descent into what they clearly feel is algorithm-induced shock with the mention of a woman who is apparently selling chocolates.
Okay, chocolates can be nice.
Chocolates molded into the exact shape of her own anus. O molde exato das minhas pregas, as the quote goes.
Oh, wow. Okay, there it is. The sheer, unadulterated shock of the narrator at this point is palpable. They reflect on everything they've just scrolled through, from the spoiled dog that wants steak, to the maybe sake-removed ribs, to the armpit discourse, and it just underscores this final sense of complete cultural disorientation, a profound loss of, quote, elegance in the digital sphere.
It's like the ultimate assertion of individual autonomy, maybe, channeled through the most extreme, hyper-commercialized, deeply personal form of expression imaginable.
And it just leaves the narrator representing perhaps a more traditional authority or viewpoint, utterly baffled and dismayed by the state of the modern internet. Quite a journey.
We have truly covered an extraordinary amount of ground today. I mean, moving from the really complex political mechanics of international sanctions.
And how they get deflected by domestic judicial validation.
Right. To the philosophy of freedom being defined by doors and walls and then plunging right through the chaotic, often contradictory, completely unfiltered expressions of the internet. It's been a ride.
For you, the learner, listening to all this, I think the core unifying challenge in processing this incredibly fragmented information is really grappling with the inherent power dynamic that underlies every single one of these sources.
That's a great point. Because whether we were talking about CLT for drivers or foreign sanctions or even online cultural norms, the fundamental question that keeps popping up is who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what is best or right for the individual?
Exactly. In Part 1, the STF asserted that it gets to decide which foreign laws apply inside Brazil, effectively challenging a global superpower.
Right. And in Part 2, the jurist asserted that their expertise, their knowledge, gave them the right to overrule the clearly stated economic preference of 80% of the actual workers involved.
And in Part 3, the difference between entire political systems was defined by the government's authority to control whether people could leave or not.
So this entire deep dive, it really forces us and you to confront the implications of mandatory compliance versus individual liberty and how that plays out across all these wildly disparate fields.
Whether it's mandatory compliance with U.S. law, or mandatory enrollment in the CLT system back in Brazil, or even the perceived pressure towards mandatory adherence to certain cultural standards online, like elegance. The conflict is always kind of the same, isn't it?
It really is. The central battle seems to be over self-determination. In pretty much every one of these sources, someone, whether it's a global power, a domestic legal expert, or even a cultural critic using a dog anecdote, is essentially claiming to know the truth better than the person or the creature actually experiencing the situation.
So let's leave you with this provocative thought to mull over as you move forward. When is authority justified in overriding an overwhelming, seemingly informed individual choice? What's the threshold?
And maybe more pointedly, what level of expertise or power or even moral certainty is required before we, as individuals, either willingly or perhaps unwillingly surrender our own self-determination, whether it's about our job, our borders, or even our online expression?
That's the big question this deep dive really leaves hanging in the air. Something for you to explore on your own.